Welcome to our weekly Parsha Shiur and podcast. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening this Shabbos, of course, an incredibly exciting Shabbos. First of all, Parshas Tetzaveh. Second of all, Parshas Zohar. Thirdly, the Shabbos before Purim. Always we read Parshas Zohar, the Shabbos before Purim. And so Be'ezus Hashem will study together some of the insights that are relevant to Parshas Tetzaveh and to Purim and Parshas Zohar. So let's start with a fascinating insight of the Gemara on Megillah Esther, which of course we read on Purim next week, Friday. Now, you know, of course, that the Gemara goes through, in many cases, almost line by line of the Megillah Esther and provides us with tremendous insights and wisdom to the background of the story, what was happening practically at the time of Purim and what to learn from it for all future generations, etc., many of which are very famous. I want to start today with two lines here in the Gemara from Megillah. Giving us deeper wisdom and understanding into and learning properly the story of Megillah Esther, which I think are not as well known or not sufficiently, they don't get enough attention. The Gemara here, this is from Masechta Megillah, Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis. The Gemara here is talking about something called Igros Horishonos. Igros Horishonos means the first letters that take place in Megillah Esther. So what is the Gemara talking about? I just want to explain the background here and then read the words from the Gemara. So we know, of course, that there are really two very famous letters, royal declarations that go out from the palace of Achashverosh to all of his 127 provinces that he was the emperor over, that he was the king over. According to the Gemara, that's the entire civilized world, the entire populated world at the time. There are two very famous sets of royal declarations that go out. The first one, in the third chapter of Megillah Esther, absolutely devastating for the Jews, perhaps the worst in Jewish history. Achashverosh, the ruler of the entire world, the Moshe B'Kippah, the ruler of the entire world of the time, together with his second in command, that vicious, infamous anti-Semite Haman, sentenced the Jews to death, Rachmana litzlan, to decimation, to annihilation, minar v'ad zoken, taf v'noshim, young and old, men and women, b'yom echad. This letter was written and released on the 13th day of Nisan. The Megillah says, in the 12th year, B'shnat Shtei Mesrei, Lamelech Achashverosh, in the 12th year of Achashverosh's rule, this letter sentencing the Jewish people to death, to complete genocide, was released on the 13th day of Nisan. Harotzim Yotzu D'chufim, the runners, the Megillah says, they rush to disseminate this letter, to spread it all around the entire world, 127 provinces, to send the letter everywhere. The letter itself, again, orchestrated by Haman, signed with Achashverosh's ring, Achashverosh's signet ring that he gave Haman with permission to do whatever he wants, sentences the Jews to death, Rachmana litzlan, complete. Every single last Jew on the face of the earth was to be annihilated. The letter also contained the date, on which date the Jews were to be completely executed and annihilated. What was the date on the letter? The date, not the date the letter was written. The date the letter was written was the 13th day of Nisan. But the date the Jews were to be executed was the 13th of Adar, 11 months later. So the letter written on the 13th day of Nisan made it clear that 11 months later, on the 13th day of Adar, the Jews were to be completely annihilated and removed from planet Earth, Rachmana litzlan. Giving people time, giving time for the letters to get to all 127 lands and for people to get themselves together and to carry out, Rachmana litzlan, this final solution of the Nazis of the times of the Achashveroshes and of the Hamans. This is the letters that were issued by the king, by the royal letters that were released and described in the third chapter of Megillah Esther on the 13th day of Nisan, in the 12th year of Achashverosh's rule. Now, approximately 3 months later, on the 23rd day of Sivan, another letter, another royal declaration was released by Achashverosh, to all 127 lands. This time, on the 23rd day of Sivan, by that time, Haman was already dead. Haman had already hung from the gallows. May all of our enemies end up there together with his sons. The tide had already turned in the Jewish people's favor. And this time, on the 23rd day of Sivan, it was Esther and Mordechai who orchestrate this royal letter, once again signed by the king, the king's ring now being given to Mordechai, for Mordechai to issue any royal declaration that he would like. And this letter, this royal declaration said very famously that the Jews could gather together, likohel, to gather, v'lamoy ladafsham, to defend themselves, lahashmid, to annihilate, to destroy all those who rose up against them, and to give the Jews permission, unconditional permission to defend themselves and to go after their enemies. Which, of course, in the end is exactly what happened. When the 13th day of Adar finally came, that is 11 months after the royal declaration against the Jews, when that day finally came, the Jews by that time had the follow-up royal declaration in their hands, from the king, giving them permission to defend themselves, which they did. The Megillah describes in no uncertain terms. They gathered together, they put together an army, they fought ferociously. Baruch Hashem, they were successful, they annihilated their enemies, and the Jews, Baruch Hashem, had experienced the miracle of Purim. Okay, these are the two famous sets of letters in the Megillah. The one in Perek Gimel, the third Perek, where the Jews are sentenced to death, Rachmana litzlan, and the second one much later in Perek Ches, in the 8th chapter of Megillah Esther, where Mordechai and Esther, together with the king, give the Jews permission to defend themselves and to annihilate their enemies, which Baruch Hashem they did. Okay. This passage of the Gemara that I want to start with here refers to something called Igrois Harishonos, the first letters of the king. The first letters of the king were issued 10 years earlier, approximately, right at the beginning of Megillah Esther, where it says, "B'shnas shalosh l'molcha," in the third year of the king's reign, the Megillah describes to us in Perek Aleph that there was a royal declaration that was made there. These are called Igrois Harishonos. Okay, I'll soon get to. You all know this. I'll get to what was written in that royal declaration. But first, just that this is referred to as Igrois Harishonos, the first royal declaration that the Megillah describes, issued by the king, long before Esther became queen, long before Haman sentenced the Jews to death, long before the miracle of Purim, years beforehand. A royal declaration was sent out by the king. This royal declaration is referred to by the Gemara as Igrois Harishonos. Here's the teaching. Omar Rava, quote, Rava taught, Ilmole Igrois Harishonos, were it not for that initial first royal decree of the king, described in Perek Aleph of Megillah Esther, were it not for that, Lo nishtayer misoin ehen shel Yisrael sorid upolit. The enemies of the Jews would have been completely annihilated, and not a thing, not a fiber of their existence would have remained. Now I put enemies of the Jews in air quotes because the Gemara isn't really referring to the enemies of the Jews. The Gemara is referring to the Jews. Excuse me. But because the Gemara is talking about a potential danger that could have, Rachmana litzlan, ended with the complete annihilation of the Jewish people, the Gemara doesn't even want to say it. It doesn't even write those words. So it writes it in a euphemistic way, pretending like we're talking about the enemies of the Jews. We're not talking about the enemies of the Jews. We're talking about the Jews. And what the Gemara is saying, what Rava is saying, is that if it were not for those letters, the Jewish people would not have survived. They would have been completely annihilated. Now, it's a very surprising thing for the Gemara to say, because those first letters had nothing to do with the Jews, nothing at all to do with the Jews. And yet the Gemara insists that those letters were so crucial and critical to the salvation of the Jews that if they hadn't been written and disseminated, the Jews would not have survived the story of Purim. Okay. So what was written in those letters? Here's the story. You're all familiar with this. Achashverosh made a feast. Well, he made two feasts, but he made the last day of the second feast, he summons his wife Vashti to appear in a very inappropriate way before himself and all of his guests. Vashti refused for her own reasons. Her appearances had been compromised again. You all know this, I'm going to get into it. Vashti refuses. And Achashverosh is left with a dilemma. Drunk, confused, he doesn't know what to do about the fact that his wife had refused to obey his command and show up. Okay. An individual called Memuchan, according to some opinions of the Gemara, Memuchan is actually Haman, appears to the king and explains to the king that his marital issues are being played out in public. The fact that he and his wife are not getting along, they're arguing over who's boss. The fact that him and his wife are arguing about this, Memuchan claims, is not restricted. It's not a private issue. You see, says Memuchan, you're the king, to Achashverosh, you're the king. And what happens in your family, your Shalom Bayis, is being played out in public and will have epic, tremendous ramifications. What goes on in your marriage is going to reverberate throughout the entire world. And if your wife, says Memuchan to Achashverosh, disobeys you and displays in public that you are not truly the man of the house, she's the one who, so to speak, wears the pants, not you. This, argued Memuchan / Haman, is going to inspire every woman in the world under your dominion, under your empire, to do the same to her husband and say, just like Vashti told her husband that she is in charge and she doesn't do what he says, in fact, he has to do what she says, so every woman will argue to her husband, from now on, I'm in charge, and I'll tell you what to do. And every man will be forced to bow his head in humility and be subdued in the presence of his wife. You have no choice, said Memuchan / Haman to Achashverosh. You have to take a stand, you have to take an aggressive stand, and it has to be public. You have to immediately dispose of Vashti and give her position to someone else who will be superior to her. And then you have to let everybody know that you have done this. You have to let everybody know, and you have to let everybody know that from now on, every man is, so to speak, the man of the house, and his wife must obey him. Now, of course, Haman has his own motivation. The Medrash says he wanted to replace Vashti with his own daughter. He wants, in the end, to kill Achashverosh and become king himself. He wants to be able to manipulate Achashverosh. He wants to be able. He's got his own plans and his own stuff going on, of course. But this is the argument he makes before Achashverosh, and Achashverosh accepts it and buys it, hook, line, and sinker, and follows exactly what Memuchan / Haman tells him to do. Number one, he disposes of Vashti, open parenthesis. The Megillah does not say explicitly that Achashverosh killed Vashti, but the Medrash makes this abundantly clear. In fact, according to the Medrash, Achashverosh didn't just order that Vashti be killed. Achashverosh actually physically executed her. He was the one who stuck her head into the guillotine of the time and had her and physically carried out the act of execution. Close parenthesis. He has Vashti is disposed of, Vashti is killed, and a royal declaration is made in which it was said, signed by the king, sent out to the entire world, that Vashti was disposed of because she had refused to follow the king's order. And therefore her royalty, her position would be given to someone else more worthy of her. And from now on, from now on, every man is the ruler of his house. Right? This is the end of chapter 1 of Megillah. Meaning that from now on, the language and the customs and the conduct of every home is determined by the husband and not by his wife. And Vashti, for disobeying her husband, was disposed of and executed. These letters were sent throughout the entire land, throughout the entire world, throughout the entire empire of Achashverosh. Omar Rava said, if not for those letters in which Achashverosh wrote that Vashti refused his orders, and therefore she was disposed of / executed, and therefore from now on every man is the head of his household, those letters were crucial for the salvation of Klal Yisrael, and if not for those, the Jewish people would have never survived. Now, this is a very strange thing to say. It doesn't seem like these letters have anything to do with Klal Yisrael. Again, at this point, the Jews are not even in danger. it would be years before Haman would even go to Achashverosh and even begin setting into motion any kind of decree against the Jews. It would be years before Mordechai even refused to bow down to Haman. Nothing's going on right now. So how does this royal declaration save the Jews? The Gemara immediately explains. The Gemara says, I'll tell you. The Gemara says it's true that when Haman's decree, Haman and Achashverosh's royal decree to annihilate the Jews was issued, it's true when this decree was issued that there was an 11-month gap between the date the proclamation was made and the date it was intended to be carried out. Again, Haman and Achashverosh sentenced the Jews to death on the 13th day of Nisan. But that's the date that the decree was issued. The day it was supposed to be carried out was 11 months later on the 13th day of Adar. It's true, says the Gemara, that there were 11 months gap in between the time the decree was issued and the time the decree was supposed to be carried out, the decree against the Jews. Says the Gemara, but according to the laws of nature, our enemies, when given an opportunity to Rahman al-Islam to execute us, they don't wait 11 months. When given an opportunity, when anti-Semites are given an opportunity, Rahman al-Islam, to hunt down a Jew and to kill them in cold blood, they don't wait 11 months, they don't wait 11 minutes. They don't wait 11 seconds. With the bloodthirsty, vicious, murderous nature that they have, they execute immediately. So by law of nature, says the Gemara, the Jews should have been killed the moment Haman's decree was issued. Why would anybody wait to the 13th day of Adar, 11 months later? Why wait? They would kill them on the spot and taken their money. You know how it goes. So why didn't they act immediately? Why did they wait? And the fact that they waited gave opportunity for Esther to go to the king, for Esther and Mordechai to figure out a plan together, for Esther to invite Haman and Achashverosh to a party, for Esther to tell Achashverosh at the party who she really was, that she was Jewish, that Haman was trying to kill her, for Haman to be hung, the tide turned, etc. But the tide was only able to turn because the Jews had time. Why'd they have time? Why'd the Goyim wait? Says the Gemara, you know why? I'll tell you why. The reason why the Goyim waited because of the Igroi Sarishonis, because of the first letters that Achashverosh issued, again, in the 3rd year of his rule, that every man is the man of the house. That royal decree made the anti-Semites wait, pause for time, when Haman sentenced them to death. What's the connection? Simple, says the Gemara. When Achashverosh issued a decree to all 127 lands, that from now on every man is the head of the household and his wife must obey him. When Achashverosh issued that royal decree, he made a complete fool and mockery out of himself. He made a complete joke out of himself. Because every place where the letter arrived, the Gemara says, every place where the letter arrived, the people said, what? We need a royal decree to tell us that the husband is the head of the house? Even, quote, a lowly weaver, which apparently in those days was not a very prestigious position. Even a lowly weaver is the head of his house. We need Achashverosh to give me permission to be the head of the house. The only one who's not the head of the house is Achashverosh himself. So in doing so, in sending these letters, Achashverosh cheapens himself and makes a complete shmata out of himself. The people said the only one who's not the head of his house is Achashverosh himself. What happened? Years later, when people get another decree, again signed by Achashverosh, this time sentencing the Jewish people to extermination, Rahman al-Islam, everybody has a very hard time taking this guy seriously. This guy sentencing the Jews to death is the same guy that a couple of years ago reminded us that we're the head of the house? Oh no, they said. This guy is a joke. This guy can't be taken for real. And so they hesitate. The Goyim, the anti-Semites, the nations of the world, they hesitate to take action against the Jews because the royal declaration, in their opinion, was signed by a complete shmata. How can we take this guy seriously if he can't even stand up to his own wife? The hesitation, the pause, was all that was necessary for Mordechai and Esther to put a plan into motion that turned the tide and saved the Jews. Omar Rava, says the Gemara, Ilmole igrois harishonos, were it not for those first initial letters sent by Achashverosh that every man should be the head of his household, in which he made a complete fool out of himself, if not for those letters, nothing from the enemies of the Jews, meaning the Jewish people themselves, they would not have survived the story of Purim, because the Goyim would have taken Achashverosh's decree to annihilate the Jews seriously enough to execute them immediately, and not wait 11 months between when the decree against the Jews was issued till it was supposed to be carried out. And the Jews wouldn't have survived. The first letters in which Achashverosh made a fool out of himself made them pause, made them not react immediately when they got the letters in which the Jews were sentenced to death. The pause was enough for Mordechai and Esther to spring into action and to save the Jews. Okay, this is what's written in the Gemara. Fascinating. Of course, the Gemara's point is that every detail in the story of the Megillah is relevant, is necessary, was part of the story of the salvation of the Jews. And this is true with the letters as well. Now, again, in other words, to highlight, we understand why the Megillah needs to tell us that Vashti was disposed of. Of course, once Vashti was disposed of, that's what created the vacuum. The king needed a new wife. Eventually, Esther takes that position. And the king doesn't know that she's Jewish, but later on, it becomes critical to the salvation of the Jews that it turns out Achashverosh is married to a Jewish woman who's there to save the Jews. But this idea that that Achashverosh sent letters to all 127 lands, how is that relevant to the story of the Megillah, to the saving of the Jews? So here the Gemara says that this made Achashverosh cheap in the eyes of all of his subjects, so they didn't take him so serious later when he sentenced the Jews to death. Of course, the fact that this letter is articulated by Memuchan, who is Haman, once again shows you that even Haman and Achashverosh and Vashti, who refuses the decree in the first place, all of whom, unbeknown to them, are all playing a part in the salvation of the Jews, even before the danger against the Jews has even surfaced. All right, this is the introduction. That's we're going to come back to this, but that's how I wanted to start this Parsha Shiur. Okay. Now let's go to Parsha Shavua. Again, this week's Parsha is Parsha Tetzaveh. And the Parshiyos, as we started learning last week, speak a lot about the Mishkan and the construction of the Mishkan and all that is involved. Parshas Tetzaveh focuses not so much on the construction of the Mishkan and its vessels, but on the garments that were worn by the Kohanim, by the Kohen Gadol. The regular Kohen, wore 4 garments, and the Kohen Gadol wore 8 garments, etc., as you all know. So if you have a Chumash in front of you, take a look here very quickly. One of the most famous garments of the Kohen Gadol was known as the Me'il. Parshas Tetzaveh, Perek Chavches, Possuk Lamed Aleph, V'asisas Me'il ha'ephod. For the Kohen Gadol, there was a special garment called the Me'il, usually translated as a robe or some kind of a coat. Klil Tchelis, the Torah says it was completely blue. And the Torah describes, right, there was an opening on the top where the Kohen Gadol could go over the Kohen Gadol's head. But the most famous part of this Me'il was what was on the bottom of the Me'il. What was there? The Asisa al Shulav, the Possuk says, Perek Chavches, Possuk Lamed Gimel, on the bottom of the Me'il, they were supposed to make Rimoine Tcheles V'Argomen of Tilas Shani, pomegranates that were blue and purple and scarlet, Upamoine Zov, and golden bells. They also had golden bells. And the Torah says, Pamoin Zov Rimoin, they were pomegranates, they were bells, Al Shulei HaMe'il, at the bottom of this garment of the Me'il. Okay. Says the Possuk, Perek Chavches, Possuk Lamed Hey, V'hoyo al Aharon l'shores. This Me'il, together with the bells and the pomegranates at the bottom, they had to be on Aaron when he would serve in the Bais Hamikdash, the Kohen Gadol. It wasn't worn by a regular Kohen. This was a garment worn only by the Kohen Gadol, the first Kohen Gadol being Aaron, and all the subsequent Kohanim Gedolim. They wore this Me'il with the pomegranates and the bells on the bottom, whenever they did the avodah in the Mishkan of the Bais Hamikdash. Then the Torah adds these words: "V'hoyalan l'shoros, v'nishma koiloi, b'voyoi el hakodesh lifnei Hashem uvetzeisoi, v'lo yomos." Again, v'nishma koiloi. The sound was heard. Its sound was heard. Whenever the Kohen Gadol would come into the Mishkan, into the Bais Hamikdash, and when he would leave, and he wouldn't die. What does that mean? That means the bells at the bottom of the garment of the Kohen Gadol would make noise. So he didn't just wear it when he actually did the avodah. He wore it when he walked in and when he walked out. And actually, the Torah says this was part of the intention. The intention was the bells at the bottom of this garment. The intention of it was that v'nishma koile b'voyel HaKadosh v'tzeisei, whenever Aaron walked in and out of the Bais Hamikdash, people should know, should make a noise. It would make noise when he would walk in and when he would walk out. V'lo yomos, the Possuk concludes, and he wouldn't die. All right, Rashi says very famously. From here, we learn that if the Kohen or the Kohen Gadol does the avodah with missing one of the garments, missing one of the begodim, he would be chayav misa b'dei shemayim. He means he would get capital punishment in the hands of heaven. It's the Torah's way of saying this is not to be taken lightly. This is life and death. The Kohen, in this case the Kohen Gadol, needs to wear all of his garments, including the me'il, with the bells and the pomegranates that would make noise every time he would walk in and every time he would walk out. And it was critical, v'lo yomos, it was critical to life itself. It was critical to life itself. V'lo yomos, he wouldn't die. All right. Comes the Baal Haturim, my dear friends. Open your minds and open your hearts, and gives us a ripping atom bomb of an interpretation on these words, v'nishma koile b'voyel HaKodesh. Listen to me very carefully. Zok the Baal Haturim, v'nishma. Again, the bells at the bottom of the garment of the Kohen Gadol would make noise. V'nishma would be heard. The word v'nishma, gimel b'mesorah, appears 3 times in all of Tanakh. The word v'nishma appears 3 times. Number one, maybe some of you can already think of which one of the famous ones. Number one, our Possuk, v'nishma koiloi b'voyei el HaKodesh. When the Kohen Gadol would come in and out, he would be heard. That's number one. Number two, kol asher dibur Hashem naseh v'nishma. Naseh v'nishma in Parshas Mishpatim. When Hashem came to the Jews and offered them the Torah, the Jews said, Naseh v'nishma, we'll do everything that it says in the Torah, we'll learn everything that it says in the Torah, we'll do it before we understand the reason, Naseh v'nishma. Another very famous example where it says v'nishma. Number three, where else do you have the word v'nishma? Megillas Esther. Perek Aleph, Possuk Chof, v'nishma piskam hamelech. This is taken from the words of Memuchan to Achashverosh, telling him that he must issue this royal decree that Vashti is being disposed of because she refused to listen, and that everybody should know that the man is the man of the house. V'nishpa piskam hamelech asher yaseh b'chol malchusay. This a royal declaration must come from the king. It must be issued throughout the king's entire empire. Ki rabohi, for it is great. Nishma piskam el sheyaseh b'chol malchusay. Ki rabohi, and all women will give respect to their husband from now on. Says Memuchan, says Haman to Achashverosh. The word v'nishma appears 3 times. Once in the context of Naseh v'nishma, the Jews accepting the Torah. Once in the context of the Kohen Gadol doing the avodah in the Bais Hamikdash, v'nishma koile b'voyel HaKodesh. And number 3, when it comes to Megillas Esther, where Achashverosh is going to issue a royal declaration to his entire kingdom, v'nishma piskam hamelech ki rabohi, his great kingdom, that all men are the head of the household, and if not, Vashti, who stood up to her husband, was executed. No. Well, what's the connection? The Jewish people accepting the Torah, saying Naseh v'nishma. The Kohen Gadol going into the Bais Hamikdash or the Mishkan with a me'il that makes noise, v'nishma koiloi. And Achashverosh's royal decree, v'nishma piskam hamelech, that he disposed of Vashti, and every man is the head of the household. What's the connection between the 3? The Baal Haturim gives unbelievable interpretation. You have to read it 3 times to understand. I won't do my best to explain it, but here's what he says. Says the Baal Haturim, there's a Gemara, another Gemara, all the way in the beginning of Masechta Megillah. The Gemara asks a question. If a person has the opportunity to do 2 mitzvahs, well, if a person has a choice, he can either study Torah, or he can go and listen to the reading of the Megillah. Which one comes first? Which one takes precedence? Rava says, the same Rava, by the way, the same Rava who taught us about the significance of the first letters, the same Rava says, Mikra Megillah v'Talmud Torah. If a person has in front of them 2 options, what do I do? Study Torah or go hear the Megillah? Mikra Megillah adif. Or in other places, the expression is mevatlin Talmud Torah l'shmoya kriyas Megillah. You stop studying Torah in order to go hear the Megillah. The mitzvah of reading the Megillah is more important than the mitzvah of studying Torah. You would stop studying Torah in order to go read the Megillah. All right, it's not for now. The commentaries discuss what do you mean? Reading the Megillah is also studying Torah. I don't want to get into that now. Just the point that the Gemara says, if you have a choice, one or the other, Torah learning or reading the Megillah, Mikra Megillah Odif, the mitzvah of reading the Megillah takes precedence. You stop studying Torah, whatever that means. You stop studying Torah in order to do the Megillah. Next, says the Gemara, what's the din if you're a Kohen or a Levi and you have 2 options? Either to work in the Bais Hamikdash, to offer up korbanos as Kohanim do, to sing on the Duchan like Leviim do, or to go and hear the Megillah. Mikra Megillah va'avoida. What takes precedence? Doing avoid in the Bais Hamikdash in the Mishkan, or going to hear the Megillah? Says the Gemara again, Mikra Megillah odif. The mitzvah of reading and hearing the Megillah takes precedence to working in the Bais Hamikdash, to working in the Mishkan. Kohanim and Leviim would have to leave the avodah that they were doing in the Mishkan and the Bais Hamikdash, well, not in Mishkan, because that was before the story of Purim, but they would have to leave the avodah that they were doing in the Bais Hamikdash in order to go hear the Mikra Megillah. The mitzvah of reading of the Megillah takes precedence to studying Torah and to doing the avodah in the Bais Hamikdash, even for Kohanim and Leviim. Says the Baal Haturim, that's the deeper meaning of these 3 v'nishmas. Listen very carefully. Again, the halacha the halacha is the mitzvah of reading the Megillah takes precedence over studying Torah, and the mitzvah of reading the Megillah, of reading or hearing the reading of the Megillah, takes precedence over doing the avodah of the Bais Hamikdash. Says the Baal. In other words, you have 3 mitzvahs. You have studying Torah, you have doing the avodah in the Bais Hamikdash, and you have the reading of the Megillah. And the reading of the Megillah takes precedence over the other 2. Says the Baal Haturim. Now listen. When the Jewish people said everything Hashem will do, Kol Asher Dibra Hashem Nasa v'Nishma, everything Hashem said we'll do and we will hear. What's v'Nishma? V'Nishma is studying Torah. So one v'Nishma is for Torah study. When the Possuk says v'Nishma koiloi b'voyel hakodesh, that the Kohen Gadol will wear the garments and he make noise when he goes in and out of the Bais Hamikdash. What's that? That's avodah. That's the second. So one v'Nishma for studying Torah. One v'nishma for doing the avodah in the Bais Hamikdash, and then the third v'nishma in Megillah Esther says v'nishma piska b'malach hashiyasa b'chol malchusoi ki rabohi. By the third v'nishma it says the word ki rabohi. So again, on a simple level, the meaning is that Achashverosh was being told your empire is so great, you have to let everybody know throughout your entire empire. That's the simple meaning of the Possuk. Says the Baal Haturim, yeah, but on a deeper level, what it's saying is that v'nishma piska, when it says v'nishma Megillah Esther, the Megillah says ki rabohi, that this v'nishma is the greatest, that this v'nishma is the greatest of all the v'nishmas. The v'nishma of hearing the Megillah reading takes precedence over the nishma of nasa v'nishma of studying Torah, over the v'nishma koil b'voyel hakodesh of doing the avodah in the Bais Hamikdash. About this v'nishma, it says ki rabohi, that it's the greatest. So with these 3 v'nishmas, the Torah is hinting to us this din of the Gemara, that reading the Megillah takes precedence to the mitzvah of studying Torah, and reading the Megillah takes precedence to the mitzvah of doing the avodah in the Bais Hamikdash. This is what the Baal Haturim says. Read it inside. This is what the meaning of it says in the Gemara Megilla. Omar Rabba said, Omar Rava. Actually, the Baal Haturim writes the word Rabba, but the commentary say it's referring to Rava. Omar Rava, Mikra Megillah v'Talmud Torah. When there's a conflict between reading the Megillah and studying Torah, Mikra Megillah Adif. The Mitzvah Megillah comes first. Mikra Megillah v'Avodah. Reading the Megillah or doing the Avodah in the Bais Hamikdash, Mikra Megillah Adif again comes first. V'Hainu. This is the meaning of these three Pessukim. When it says v'nishma nasa v'nishma studying Torah, when it says v'nishma koile b'voyel hakodesh, that's the avodah in the Bais Hamikdash. V'nishma piskam hamelech, when it says in the Megillah v'nishma hainu kriyas haMegillah, v'samuch ki rabbi, and it says about the third one, Rabbi, this is the greatest. Alma, we see the adif tfei, that the mitzvah of reading or hearing the reading of the Megillah is superior. Okay. The Baal Haturim adds 4 words. He says, V'gam Rabba ka'omar lo, which I don't want to get into because it's a big conversation among the commentaries. It seems that the Baal Haturim had a girsa, a version of the Gemara, where this teaching of the precedence of the mitzvah of Megillah is taught by a sage called Rabba. In our Gemaras, it's Rava. The question is, what exactly does the Baal Haturim mean here? That he had a different version, where he's pointing out that the one who gives this teaching, his actual name is Rabbah, or did he have the same version as us, Rava, but Rava also has the same meaning of the word Rabbah. I don't want to get into that now. Be it as it may, I want to stick to this point that the 3 Venishmas in Tanakh refer to these 3 mitzvahs, studying Torah, the avodah in the Bais Hamikdash, and reading the Megillah. And we see here by the mitzvah of reading of the Megillah, Venishma, Piskam HaMelech, Ki Rabbahi, that this is the mitzvah that is superior over all the others. Okay. Now here I want to ask you 3 questions. Question number 1. The first one is not necessarily directly a question of the Baal Haturim, but on the idea the Baal Haturim is highlighting. The Gemara tells us that the mitzvah of reading or hearing the reading of the Megillah takes precedence to studying Torah and doing the avodah in the Bais Hamikdash. If you think about this sort of on a philosophical level, it becomes a very, very difficult halacha to understand. The Gemara and Medrash discuss what it was, the sin, which aveira did the Jewish people do in the times of Purim, that ended them up in such hot water that they were all sentenced to death. The Gemara gives different explanation. Medrash provides different explanations. Be it as it may, there's a couple of things that we do know. Number 1, Mordechai told the Jews not to go to the party of Achashverosh, not to celebrate. Had they listened to Mordechai and not gone, they would have been spared Haman's decree. Number 2, when Achashverosh actually celebrated at his party, that the Jews disobeying Mordechai attended, we know that Achashverosh dressed himself in the garments of the Kohen Gadol. We know that Achashverosh displayed the kalim, used the kalim of the Bais Hamikdash, and that this aggravated the sin of the Jews disobeying Mordechai and participating, not just participating, enjoying, the Gemara says, enjoying the meal of Achashverosh, sitting there, Achashverosh, and the Medrash says, Vashti did the same. She also put on the garments of the Kohen Gadol, and she also used the kalim of the Bais Hamikdash. Because of these sins, the Jewish people ended up, Rahman al-Islam, with a death sentence on their head. If this is the case, it seems like the reason in the story of Purim why the Jewish people ended up in trouble in the first place is because they didn't obey the Torah. They didn't obey what Mordechai told them. They went to the meal, they sinned. They sinned with the Medrash says, with immorality, with avodah zarah, etc. They sinned, meaning they didn't obey the Torah. And they desecrated the holiness of the Bais Hamikdash by sitting at a meal with a goyish king dressed in the garments of the Kohen Gadol, serving his meal in the kalim of the Bais Hamikdash. If they had respected the Torah and the Bais Hamikdash enough, they wouldn't have ended up in trouble in the first place. And yet the Gemara says that when it comes to if there is some kind of conflict between the mitzvahs, the mitzvah of reading or hearing the reading of the Megillah overrides Torah learning, and even avoid in the Bais Hamikdash. But why? If the Jews had respected Torah learning and avoided the Bais Hamikdash sufficiently in the first place, we wouldn't have the story of Purim because they wouldn't be in trouble in the first place. The halacha sort of from a deeper level seems very difficult to understand. Study the Torah with the respect it deserves. Give the respect to the Bais Hamikdash that it deserves. And you won't have to read the story of Purim because the Jews won't be in trouble in the first place. No, says the Gemara. Stop studying Torah, stop the avoid in the Bais Hamikdash, and go listen to the Megillah. To how the Jews ended up in trouble with a death sentence and how they were saved. All of which could have been avoided if they had studied, if they had fulfilled the Torah and respected the Bais Hamikdash properly. Seems backwards. That's question number one. Question number two, the commentaries struggle with this tremendously. Reading the Megillah is a rabbinic mitzvah. To hear the reading of the Megillah is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. This is from the rabbis. Studying Torah and doing avoid in the Bais Hamikdash is biblical. How do you have a rabbinic mitzvah overriding a biblical mitzvah? So without getting into too much, again, of the lomdus, without getting into too much of the minutiae, there's a rule that under certain circumstances, rabbis have that right. They have the power, called sheval tasa. They can tell, the rabbinic laws have a right to tell Jews not to engage in a biblical positive mitzvah. The Torah says, study Torah. Chachamim say, go listen to the Megillah. The Torah says, do the avoid of the Bais Hamikdash. Chachamim say, go read the Megillah. Okay. The Chachamim have that power, granted. But why? Why? What's the motive of the Chachamim here? To tell Jews who are studying Torah and working in the Bais Hamikdash, doing biblical mitzvahs, tell them, stop what you're doing and go fulfill a rabbinic mitzvah of listening to the reading of the Megillah. Granted, Chachamim have that power, but why are they using it in this case? What's their motive? What do we hope to accomplish by neglecting a biblical mitzvah and engaging in a rabbinic mitzvah? Oh, the commentaries say, well, it means that they're going to be able to go back and study Torah later. It means they're going to be able to go back and do the avoid of the Bais Hamikdash later. According to some opinions. According to other opinions, no. Even if they don't end up neglecting the avoid of the Bais Hamikdash. And even the time that you spend not studying Torah, reading the Megillah, you cannot get the time back. Sometimes Chachamim uproot this and say, no, walk away from the biblical positive mitzvah and go fulfill a rabbinic mitzvah. Again, I'm not asking how they have that right. The Gemara says they have it. We learned it from Pessukim. But let's understand what's the incentive of the Chachamim. Why do they want to? Why do they want to do this? That's question two. And question three is the particular verse that the Baal Haturim is quoting from V'nishma Piskam HaMelech, the Baal Haturim is quoting from the Megillah, has nothing to do really. I mean, again, it's these Igrois HaRishonos that we're talking about. But this mitzvah, this Possuk doesn't say anything about the Megillah. Nasa V'nishma is about studying Torah. V'nishma Koil is about the Kohen Gadol doing the avoid in the Bais Hamikdash. V'nishma Piskam HaMelech, in other words, it's a Possuk about a specific detail in the story of the Megillah. It's not talking about the Megillah. Later on, at the end, the Megillah itself says that Mordechai and Esther wrote out the whole story, and this is the Megillah that we're reading, and they sent it to all the Jews, and they told them to read it, etc., etc. But this V'nishma Piskam HaMelech, this is talking about, again, on a simple level, about a Possuk. This is a Possuk about Achashverosh making a complete idiot out of himself in front of everybody. That's the Possuk from which we learn that the reading of the Megillah, for some reason, takes precedence over everything else. What's the significance of that Possuk? Three questions. Number one, why read the Megillah instead of studying Torah and doing the avoid of the Bais Hamikdash? It seems like the Jews ended up in trouble in the times of Purim only because they didn't fulfill the Torah and didn't sufficiently respect the Bais Hamikdash. Number two, what is in it? What's the motive here for the Chachamim to tell Jews to walk away from biblical mitzvahs and fulfill rabbinic mitzvahs? And three, what's the Baal Haturim want here with this Possuk? V'nishma Piskam HaMelech ki Rabohi, highlighting this as being the Possuk that teaches us that the reading of the Megillah supersedes everything else. It seems to be not a Possuk about the story of the Megillah. It's not a Possuk about the Megillah. It's a story about a king making a complete idiot out of himself. Okay. The explanation here, I think, is actually, I think it's relatively simple, but I think it speaks directly to the heart of the essence of the story of Purim, of what really the Yom Tov and all of it is, and what the whole Yom Tov and the whole Megillah is trying to articulate. What's the point? What's the point of the whole story of the Megillah? It's not just that the Jews were in danger and then they were saved. This happened, unfortunately, many times before Purim and many times after. Unfortunately, may Hashem continue to protect us. It's not just that there was great miracles. Again, in the story of Purim, the miracles are all play themselves out within the framework of nature. It's not just that there were great Jewish heroes. There were many great Jewish heroes before. There were many great Jewish heroes after, etc. What makes the story of Purim unique, or the highlight, if you will, is what people refer to as the V'nafechu. V'nafechu means the transformation. Here you had a situation where the Jewish people were in such incredible danger. Unprecedented. The danger that is unprecedented, because, like the Gemara says, there was nowhere for the Jews to run. There was no safe space anywhere on planet Earth. And then it turns out that there was a complete transformation, meaning the very forces that worked against the Jews, the very things that endangered them, in the end propelled the Jews and gave them the greatest Yom Tov of Jewish history. Achashverosh signs a royal decree that the Jews can defend themselves. Bais Hamikdash, the house of Haman, is given to Esther. The queen is Jewish. Achashverosh appoints Mordechai to be his chief advisor. It turns out that Haman was instrumental in making Queen Esther queen in the first place, because he was the one who said, get rid of Vashti. And this is how Esther became, in other words, it turned out the whole thing, the transformation is that everything that seemed dark, that everything that seemed to be working against them, that everything that posed a danger, that scared and rattled the Jews, was actually those very ingredients. It turns out, it was revealed that everything was working on behalf of the Jews. The transformation where the darkness turns into turns into light. This is the unique gift, is highlighted by no story like the story of Purim, where the Jews go from the very depths of danger to one of the greatest victories in Jewish history, right? The Gemara says, one of the reasons why we don't say Hallel on Purim, when we say Hallel on Purim, the Gemara says, because the reading of the Megillah is Hallel. Read the story, see what happened. And you'll see that this is the destiny of the Jews. They don't just survive. We don't just survive. We don't just strive. We don't just emerge. We take the darkness itself, we take the Achashveroshes, and we turn them into the forces that propel the Jewish people to the next level. Okay. This is the essence, really, of what the story of Purim is trying to capture. Where do you see this? Where do you see this play out? You see it play out, first of all, in the Jewish people's victory. But in addition to the Jewish people's military victory, you see it, I think, incredibly powerful in two other ways. What is it? Also, both very famous. Number one, very famous Gemara, Masechta Shabbos, Daf Pei Ches Amud Aleph. When the Rabbi Shalom gave the Torah to the Jews at Har Sinai, he hung the mountain over their heads, and he said, either you accept the Torah, or I bury you all here. All right. The Jews accepted the Torah, of course. Right? They accepted the Torah. They accepted the Torah. Hashem didn't bury them. Hashem put the mountain down and everybody survived. Well, they expired from Hashem speaking to them. But Hashem didn't bury them under the mountain. Okay. Says the Gemara, Masechta Shabbos, Daf Pei Ches Amud Aleph, you can read it black and white. Says the Gemara, there was an unresolved issue that went on for a long time, for about 1,000 years, until the story of Purim. What happened? The Jewish people's acceptance of the Torah was coerced. Hashem hung the mountain over their heads and said, if you don't accept the Torah, I'll bury you here. No. You call that free choice? In your face, down your throat, Judaism with a smile. What do the Jews want to do? Mikan moido rabo lo iraisa. There's that word rabo again. Mikan moido rabo lo iraisa, says the Gemara. From here, there was a great argument against the acceptance of the Torah. The Jews were coerced until Purim. In the days of Purim, this issue was finally laid to rest. On a simple level, why? Because when the Jewish people experienced the miracle of Purim, they were so excited, they were so appreciative, they were so joyful, that they re-accepted the Torah without being coerced. They re-accepted upon themselves the Torah, and Kabbalas HaTorah was b'shleimus in the times of Purim, not before. Now here's the irony of this. On the one hand, we say, had the Jews obeyed the Torah, had they not ended up at Achashverosh's feast, had they listened to Mordechai and not gone, had they not sinned, had they not enjoyed the meal, had they not bowed down to the idol of Nebuchadnezzar, etc., they would have never been sentenced in the first place. On the other hand, think this thing through. If they would have never been sentenced, they would have never been saved. If they would have never been saved, they would have never been aroused, they would never been inspired to accept the Torah on their own. And the challenge, the reservation with the acceptance of the Torah at Har Sinai would have remained. Again, for 1,000 years, the Jewish people's Kabbalas HaTorah is insufficient. The Gemara says, this great arm that Jewish people can, at any point that you can turn around and go, actually, I never signed up for this of my own free will. You forced me. It's only resolved, after the miracles of Purim. But the miracles of Purim only happened because of the dangers of Purim. So on the one hand, we say if the Jews had obeyed the Torah, they wouldn't have ended up in danger. On the other hand, if they wouldn't have ended up in danger, they would have never been saved, and then they would have never accepted the Torah. And here you have the same benafechu. Here you have the same transformation. Once again, you see the same process. With the same thing that seems so dark for the Jews, where the Jews descend to such a low level, where they're sitting at the meal of Achashverosh, disobeying the Torah of Mordechai, that itself becomes transformed. That itself becomes the platform which facilitates the Jews fully accepting the Torah for the first time. That's one. Where else do you see this? Unbelievable to me. We know from the Pessukim and the Midrashim that the Jewish people started to build the second Bais Hamikdash before the story of Purim. I don't want to get into the details now, but this is what it said. They began constructing the second Bais Hamikdash before the whole story of Purim. And Haman and his sons were instrumental in stopping it. Achashverosh wanted to give them permission to continue. Vashti stopped him. The Jews tried to rebuild the second Bais Hamikdash before the story of Purim, and it wasn't successful. After the story of Purim, it was successful. How? How were they able to rebuild the second Bais Hamikdash? Because there was a king called Daryavesh who allowed the Jews to rebuild the second Bais Hamikdash. And who was Daryavesh? Daryavesh was the son born from the marriage of Achashverosh and Esther. The biological son of Achashverosh and Esther, a king called Daryavesh, he was the one who allowed the Jewish people to rebuild the second Bais Hamikdash, which stood for 420 years. And again, here you have the same incredible transformation. On the one hand, the Jewish people are sitting at the meal of Achashverosh. He is sitting in the garments of the Kohen Gadol, serving them food in the vessels of the Bais Hamikdash. They're sitting there and they're enjoying it, desecrating the kedusha of the Bais Hamikdash. Achashverosh is celebrating the fact that 70 years have passed and the second Bais Hamikdash has not been rebuilt. And Almighty God is sitting in heaven saying, how can you sit at such a meal and enjoy it? And because of that, the Jews are sentenced, Rahman al-Islam, to death. But then they're saved. They're saved, and the very king who sentenced them to death has a child with a Jewish woman, and he tells the Jews, go back and build the second Bais Hamikdash. If the story of Purim would have never happened, it would have never been necessary for Esther to marry Achashverosh. And who knows if there would have ever been a king Well, eventually the second Bais Hamikdash would have been rebuilt, but it would have had to. Permission would have had to come from somewhere else. Here, the story of Purim that gives us the decree against the Jews. In the end, when the miracle happens, in the end, produces the king that tells the Jews go back and rebuild the Bais Hamikdash. And again, you see the v'nafrechu, that the same king Achashverosh, who appoints Haman and elevates him and makes him a second in command and gives Haman a signet ring and tells him, go and do with the Jews, go and do whatever you want. He's the same king who fathers the next king who tells the Jews go back and build and rebuild the second Bais Hamikdash. And they do. And it stands for 420 years. The v'nafrechu here, the transformation, is we see it both, first of all, with the existence of the Jews, of course, but we see it with regard to Torah, where as a result of Purim, the Jews accept the Torah, and we see it with regard to the Bais Hamikdash, where as a result of the story of Purim, a Jewish king, son of Esther, Jewish king, tells the Jews to go back and rebuild the second Bais Hamikdash. Okay. Perhaps on a deeper level, I want to try to wrap this up. Perhaps on a deeper level, this becomes the deeper significance what the Gemara says. You're mevatel the mitzvah of Talmud Torah in order to read the Megillah. Or you're mevatel the mitzvah of doing the avoid in the Bais Hamikdash. The Gemara says you mevatel the mitzvah of Talmud Torah in order to read the Megillah, to hear the reading of the Megillah. And you mevatel the mitzvah of avoid in the Bais Hamikdash in order to go hear the reading of the Megillah. Why? We asked before. This is the biblical mitzvah. This is the rabbinic mitzvah. And if the Jews would have kept the Torah and respected the Bais Hamikdash, we wouldn't have had the story of Purim in the first place. Yes, it's true. But let not the deeper message of the Megillah be lost on you. Go, says the Gemara. You're studying Torah, says the Gemara. Go be mevatel Torah and read the Megillah. You're working in the Bais Hamikdash, says the Gemara. Stop the avoid in the Bais Hamikdash, even according to some opinions, if you won't be able to continue it later. Stop the mitzvah of working in the Bais Hamikdash and go hear the reading of the Megillah. What are you going to hear over there? That even when things are dark for the Jews, Rahman al-Islam, that even in a situation where the Jewish people are sentenced to annihilation, even when the Jews are sentenced to annihilation because they haven't studied Torah, they haven't obeyed the Torah, and they haven't sufficiently respected the Bais Hamikdash, fear not, says the Megillah, v'nafaychu, everything will be transformed. The Jewish people will be saved. La Yehudim, for the Jews, there will be oira v'simcha v'sosen v'kor. Not only that, but they will finally be able to accept the Torah properly for the first time in Jewish history. Not only that, but this is going to be responsible for the building of the Bais Hamikdash. Perhaps we have to interpret the words of the Gemara this way. You think you're stopping to study Torah to go and hear the reading of the Megillah. You think it's bittul Torah to go and listen to the reading of the Megillah. But if you listen to the Megillah properly, you'll understand that this is not bittul Torah, this is the kiyum of Torah. This is bedavka. At this point, the Jewish people begin to accept upon themselves the Torah, which until the story of Purim they couldn't do. You think you're stopping to do the avoid in the Bais Hamikdash in order to go hear the Megillah? Go listen to the Megillah. Hear what's being said. When you listen to it properly, you'll hear the building of the Bais Hamikdash, not the bittul of the avoid of the Bais Hamikdash. Listen properly, says the Gemara. You'll hear that when in the reading of the Megillah, that even when a Jew chas v'shalom experiences bittul Torah and bittul avoid of the Bais Hamikdash, we're talking here about a Yid. A Yid, the destiny of a Yid, it's always v'nafechu. Every darkness is transformed into light. Every negativity it's not possible for it to be any other way. The neshama is connected. It has to end. No matter what the Yid goes through, it has to end with a deeper acceptance of the Torah and a stronger Bais Hamikdash. Always. Even Haman himself, in the end, also plays a role and a part in this. Says the Baal Haturim, the word v'nishma appears 3 times. Once by Kabbalah Torah, once working in the Bais Hamikdash, and the 3rd time, v'nishma piska mamelech, when Achashverosh issues a decree to sentence that every man should be the man of his house. Says the Megillah, this Piska Mamelech, this royal decree, Kirabohi, this is greatness. This is where you see the greatness of the story of the Megillah. This is why the Megillah takes precedence over Nasa V'Nishma and over V'Nishma Koil B'Voil HaKodesh. Why? This is where you see the greatness. What happened? The king, inspired by Haman, issues a decree that every man should be head of his household. Now think, Achashverosh is going to marry a Jewish woman. He doesn't know that yet. When he marries her, he doesn't know that she's Jewish, but he will. And what's going to happen? If he's the head of the household, why should he listen to her? If he announced that every man is in charge of his house, so then he takes precedence over Esther, why should he listen to Esther? It seems like this is devastating for the Jews. Not only is it not devastating, but this very letter, V'nishma Piska Mamelech, this very letter in the end saves the life of the Jews. In the words of Rava, if not for Igros Rishonos, nothing would be left of the Jews. They owe their existence to these letters of Amelech Achashverosh. Says the Baal Haturim, it's the same V'nishma. That's the same word, Nasa V'nishma. V'nishma Koiloi B'Voyel HaKodesh, it's the same V'nishma. When you say Nasa V'nishma, when you say I'm going to fulfill what's written in the Torah, V'nishma, I'm going to listen. You have to listen, says the Baal Haturim. You have to listen. What do you hear? You have to hear the Yid. You have to hear the V'nafechu. You have to hear that every Yid takes every bittul Torah, every challenge, and transforms it into Mikra Megillah. Every time the Kohen Gadol walked in and out of the Bais Hamikdash, the bells at the bottom of his coat jingled. V'nishma koiloi. What are we supposed to hear in these jingling of the bells? But what's the significance? The Kohen Gadol walks into the Bais Hamikdash and the bells jingle. Why? Says the Baal Haturim, you know why? Because V'nishma Piska Mamelech Asher Yaseh B'chol Malchusei Kirabohi. Listen to the V'nishma of Kirabohi of Megillah Esther. Listen to the V'nishma of the story that the Torah tells us in Megillah Esther, where Achashverosh, the king, who sentences the Jews to death, is the same Achashverosh who's responsible for the Jews to have Oira V'Simcha V'Sos and V'Kor salvation, Kabbalas HaTorah like we never had before in Jewish history, and in the end, the construction of the Bais Hamikdash. Let me add 2 points. Number one, on the words V'nishma Piska Mamelech in the Megillah, the Medrash adds, Medrashically, the Medrash says, the Medrash says, whenever it says Hamelech in the Megillah, it also refers to Hashem. So when it says V'nishma Piska Mamelech, the decree of the king will be heard, it's referring to a decree of Hashem. Which decree of Hashem? Medrash says this. Which decree of Hashem? The decree of Hashem, Ki mochoi emches zecher Amalek. That's the Piska Mamelech which is being heard as Achashverosh executes Vashti with his own 2 hands, creating the way for Esther to come forward and be queen. Issuing royal declarations that every man should be head of his house. Says the Medrash, make no mistake, there's a declaration that's coming from Hamelech, from the Eibashter, from Hashem himself. And it says, Mochoi emches zecher Amalek. Hashem is using this to annihilate Amalek. Everybody who looks at this will go, oh my God, what's going on here? Achashverosh is now completely manipulatable by Haman. He will use this manipulation tool to sentence the Jews to death. And he will. The Nishma, says the Medrash, don't get fooled by the exterior. Listen, pay attention. You know what's really going on here? Hashem is annihilating the entire memory of Amalek. Mochei emche zecher Amalek. All right, last point. Let's go back to the Possuk in Parsha Tetzaveh. V'nishma koil b'voyel HaKodesh, says the Possuk. When Aaron goes in and out, the sound of the ringing of the pomegranates should be heard. B'voyel HaKodesh lifnei, when he comes into the Bais Hamikdash, when he leaves, and the Possuk adds, v'lo yomos, and he won't die. Again, on a simple level, like Rashi explains, the Torah is telling us that Kohen Gadol, and every Kohen has to wear all of the garments the Torah says you have to wear. If not, you're chayav misa b'dei shamayim. Yes. But the Baal Haturim says that this V'nishma is telling us to go to the Megillah. What does it say in the Megillah? In the Megillah, it says about every single Yid, lo yomus, that he or she will never die. Never die physically and never die spiritually. Yes, Jews, Rahman al-Islam, go through very, very dark times, like in the story of Purim, like the times we're living in now. But the Venishma Piskam HaMelech reminds us, V'lo Yomos, that none of it is here, God forbid, to exterminate the Jews. The Jews are the only thing that will remain. Everything else comes and goes. The only one that V'lo Yomos is the Yid. Hear that in every ringing of the bells at the bottom of the garments of the Kohen Gadol. In the end, in the ringing of the bells, we're supposed to hear Piskam HaMelech, the saying of the Rabbi Shalom. It's the Torah's way of reminding us one more time. The purpose of the creation of the world is for the Yid, is for the Jew. The Jew, the only one who gets sometimes a little confused, forgets who he is, sits a little too long at the meal of Achashverosh and thinks Achashverosh is going to keep us safe. Rachmana litzlan. The Jew sometimes gets a little carried away with that. But as soon as the Jew remembers, as soon as he hears the ringing of the bell, Piskam HaMelech, the Rabban Shalom says, Amalek will be wiped out. Then V'lo Yomos, the Jew doesn't die. The Jew doesn't die physically or spiritually. Instead, it's a chodesh, it's a v'nafechu, it's a month that is transformed for us. L'simcha, l'yamim tovim, for simcha, for happiness. For the Jews, there should be oira, v'simcha, v'sosim, because as we face, unfortunately today, once again the Hamans of the world, and once again the Hamas of the world, and once again those who seek no less than Haman did, than Amalek did, to annihilate us completely, old, young, men, women, children, babies, older people, Rahman al-Islam. We hear the Piskam HaMelech, we hear the cry of the Rabbeinu Shalom. Mochoy emche es zeicher Amalek, the Rabbeinu Shalom reassures every Yid, I, the Rabbeinu Shalom, will wipe out every remnant of Amalek till there's nothing left. And if there is danger, Rahman al-Islam, if there is a moment of fear, Hashem says, remember, it will be transformed. From this will come oira, v'simcha, v'sasen v'kor. From this will come Kabbalah Satira like never before in Jewish history. From this will come binyan Bais Hamikdash like never before in Jewish history. May we celebrate the rebuilding of the third Bais Hamikdash speedily in our days, please God, before Purim this year, with the coming of our righteous Mashiach in this holy month, the month of Adar. Amen. Ken Yehi Ratzon.